The person who once made you feel too much, too loud, too needy, is now standing in front of you, speechless. And here is what nobody tells you about that moment. Their silence is not confusion. It is recognition. They finally see who you actually were the entire time. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is not about revenge. It is not about winning. It is about something so much more profound than that. It is about what happens inside a human being when they finally stop performing safety for someone who was never safe. Avoidant attachment is not a character flaw. Let that land for a moment, because the world has not been kind in explaining this to you. You have likely spent years, perhaps decades, quietly absorbing the message that something is fundamentally wrong with the way you love, the way you need, the way you reach for connection, and then pull back from it as though the very thing you desired most was also the thing most capable of destroying you. You have been called cold. You have been called distant. You have been called commitment phobic, emotionally unavailable, difficult, and closed. And somewhere along the way, you may have started to believe it. You may have started to construct an identity around the very wound that was trying to protect you. But here's the truth that developmental psychology, trauma research, and the lived testimony of thousands of human beings converges upon with extraordinary consistency. Avoidant attachment is not who you are. It is what you learned. And there is a profound, life-altering difference between those two things. Every child enters this world with the same fundamental biological imperative. Not food first, not shelter first, connection first. The infant does not arrive as a self-sufficient being who occasionally desires warmth. The infant arrives as a creature whose entire neurological survival depends on proximity to a caregiver who is emotionally present, responsive, and safe. This is not sentimentality, this is neuroscience. The developing brain literally organizes itself around the quality of its earliest relational experiences. It builds its architecture, its capacity for trust, its tolerance for intimacy, its ability to regulate emotion, not in isolation, but in relationship. And so, what happens to that developing brain, to that exquisitely sensitive nervous system, when the connection it reaches for is not reliably there? What happens when the caregiver is physically present but emotionally absent? What happens when the expression of need is met with irritation, dismissal, or silence? What happens when a child cries and the response is indifference, or worse, punishment? The brain does what all brilliant adaptive systems do in the face of a threat it cannot escape. It reorganizes. It finds a strategy. It learns. And the strategy it learns, the strategy we now call avoidant attachment, is devastatingly elegant in its logic. If needing people brings pain, then learn not to need. If vulnerability invites rejection, then bury the vulnerability so deep that even you forget it is there. If emotional expression causes the caregiver to withdraw, then suppress the emotion, silence the longing, and present to the world a version of yourself that appears to require nothing from anyone. Become self-sufficient, not because self-sufficiency is your nature, but because dependency felt like standing on a bridge that kept collapsing beneath your feet. This is not coldness. This is intelligence in the service of survival. This is a child making the only rational choice available inside an irrational emotional environment. And the tragedy, the deep, aching tragedy, is not that the strategy failed. The tragedy is that it worked. It worked so well that the child carried it into adulthood, into friendships, into romantic relationships, into every space where genuine intimacy became possible, and activated the same defense that once kept them safe in a world that was not. The avoidant adult is not someone who does not feel. They are someone who learned at a cellular level that feeling was not permitted. They are not someone incapable of love. They are someone who loved so early and so completely and received so little consistent love in return that the nervous system made a quiet, unconscious, entirely understandable decision that love is not safe enough to need openly. So when you look at the avoidant person in your life, or when you look in the mirror and recognize these patterns in yourself, do not reach first for judgment. Reach instead for the question underneath the behavior. Ask what that child needed that they did not receive. Ask what wound is still being managed through the armor of distance. Ask not what is wrong with this person, but what happened to this person and what it would mean, what it would require, for them to finally believe that needing someone will not cost them everything. That is where healing begins, not in fixing what was never broken, but in finally understanding what the breaking actually was. If this is reaching something real inside you, share this with someone still waiting to be chosen. Save it for the night you forget how far you've come. Your healing is not small, and neither are you. The version of you that has emerged is not a performance. It is not a carefully constructed response to someone else's rejection, or a strategic reinvention designed to provoke envy, or a mask you have put on over the wound to make the wound less visible. It is something far more sacred and far more disruptive than any of that. It is the self that was always present beneath the years of accommodation, beneath the chronic self-minimization, beneath the exhausting and invisible labor of making yourself palatable to people whose own unhealed pain required you to stay small. What has emerged is not new, it is original, and there is a difference that matters enormously. The nervous system, when it has been shaped by early relational trauma, does not simply store memory the way a filing cabinet stores documents. It stores experience in the body itself, in the tension of the shoulders, in the shallowness of the breath, in the reflexive contraction that happens the moment someone gets close enough to matter. Healing, therefore, is not an intellectual exercise. It is not achieved by understanding your attachment style in the abstract, or by reading the right book, or by arriving at a clever insight during a quiet moment of reflection. Those things matter, but they are the beginning, not the destination. Real healing, the kind that actually changes the way you move through the world, happens at the level of the nervous system. It happens in the body. It happens in the slow, often non-linear, frequently uncomfortable process of teaching your physiology that safety is now available, even when every conditioned reflex is insisting otherwise. And this is precisely why the emerged version of you is so profoundly shocking to people who knew you before. They did not simply know you as a person. They knew you as a nervous system in a particular state of dysregulation. They knew the version of you that fawned, that apologized preemptively, that made yourself emotionally smaller so that the other person could feel larger. They knew the version of you that confused intensity with intimacy, that tolerated inconsistency because consistency had never been modeled as a form of love, that stayed in relationships long past the point of health because leaving felt like reconfirming the oldest wound, that you were not worth staying for. That version of you was not a lie. It was a survival response, but it was not the whole of you. It was never the whole of you. When the nervous system begins to heal, when, through whatever combination of therapy, self-inquiry, somatic awareness, genuine relationships, or simply the accumulating weight of your own refusal to keep abandoning yourself, when it begins to register safety as a real and available experience rather than a theoretical concept, something shifts that cannot be undone. You stop shrinking, not all at once, and not without grief, because there is real grief in recognizing how long you made yourself small and how much it cost you, but you stop. And in the stopping, the authentic self does not so much emerge as it does exhale. It rises not like a dramatic transformation, but like a quiet, unstoppable tide. This is the moment that disorients the people around you, because what they are experiencing is not simply a change in your behavior. They are experiencing the collapse of a relational dynamic that depended, structurally, on your willingness to be less than you are. The avoidant person in your life, the one whose emotional unavailability you spent so long trying to earn your way through, built their comfort on the specific texture of your insecurity. Your anxious reaching confirmed their sense of self. Your need for reassurance allowed them to feel powerful without being vulnerable. Your willingness to accept breadcrumbs as a meal gave them permission to never set a full table. And now you are not hungry in the same way anymore. Now you have learned to feed yourself, and that, to a nervous system organized around maintaining emotional control through distance, is genuinely destabilizing. Their shock is not about you becoming someone unrecognizable. Their shock is the visceral, unspoken realization that the version of you they were comfortable with, the version that needed them more than it needed itself, has healed its way out of that particular hunger, and healing for everyone in proximity to it always demands a reckoning. Avoidants are not cold. This is perhaps the most important misunderstanding to dismantle, because the consequences of getting it wrong are enormous, not just for the people who love avoidance and interpret their distance as indifference, but for the avoidants themselves, who have often internalized this misreading so deeply that they have come to believe it as a fundamental truth about their own nature. They walk through the world carrying a story about themselves, that they are simply not emotional people, that they do not need closeness the way others do, that independence is their authentic state rather than their most sophisticated defense. And that story, however convincingly it has been performed and however genuinely it has been believed, is not the truth. It is the wound speaking in the first person. The research on avoidant attachment is unambiguous on this point in a way that should stop us entirely. When avoidantly attached individuals are placed in situations designed to activate their attachment system, when they are shown images of separation, when they are asked to recall times of loss or rejection, when they are brought into proximity with genuine emotional intimacy, their physiological responses are indistinguishable from, and in some studies more intense than, those of anxiously attached individuals. Their heart rate elevates, their cortisol spikes, their nervous system activates in precisely the ways we would expect from someone who is deeply, viscerally affected by relational experience. The difference is not in the feeling, the difference is in what happens next. Where the anxiously attached person moves toward the feeling, expresses it, amplifies it outward, the avoidantly attached person has developed a suppression mechanism so efficient, so automatic, so thoroughly practiced since early childhood, that the feeling is rerouted before it ever reaches conscious awareness. They do not feel nothing. They feel everything and then immediately unconsciously redirect that everything into cognitive activity, into withdrawal, into the performance of not needing, because needing, in their earliest experience, was the most dangerous thing they could do. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the cost of that. To move through every intimate relationship carrying the full weight of human longing, the same longing for connection, for being truly seen, for belonging somewhere and to someone, and to have every impulse toward that longing intercepted by a nervous system that learned, before language, before conscious memory, before any capacity for choice, that expressing the longing would result in pain. This is not emotional absence. This is emotional imprisonment. And the prison has no visible bars, which makes it infinitely harder to escape because you cannot dismantle walls you have been taught to call freedom. The avoidant person does not pull away because they do not care. They pull away because caring feels like standing at the edge of something catastrophic. Intimacy, for them, does not carry the primary association of warmth and safety that securely attached individuals experience. It carries the association of their earliest relational environment, an environment where closeness preceded disappointment, where vulnerability preceded abandonment, where the very act of reaching out was met with responses that taught the nervous system to associate love with loss. And so the proximity that another person experiences as connection, the avoidant experiences as exposure. The moment of genuine emotional contact that feels like arrival to one partner feels like danger to the other, not because they are broken, because they are responding with perfect fidelity to the map their early experiences drew for them. And here is what matters most, what carries the deepest implications for how we understand avoidant people and how we understand ourselves in relation to them. Their shock at your growth, their disorientation when you stop accommodating their distance, their strange combination of pursuit and panic when you finally withdraw the anxious reaching they had grown dependent upon, none of that is cruelty. It is their unresolved wound being held up to the light for the first time. When you heal, you become an unwilling mirror. You reflect back to them the possibility of a different way of being, and that reflection is simultaneously the most hopeful and most threatening thing their nervous system has ever encountered, because it means the walls were never the truth of them either, and walls, when they have been load-bearing long enough, are terrifying to question. Trauma-bonded relationships depend on your smallness, not metaphorically, not poetically, but structurally and functionally, in the most literal sense of how relational dynamics organize themselves around the specific shape of each person's unhealed wound. The relationship was not built on love alone, however real the love may have felt. It was built on a complementary architecture of pain, your wound fitting into their wound the way two broken pieces of the same fractured object might press against each other and briefly create the illusion of wholeness. Your anxiety needed their avoidance to confirm its oldest belief. Their avoidance needed your anxiety to maintain its most essential defense. And together, without either of you choosing it consciously, without either of you understanding what was actually being constructed, you built a system that could only remain stable as long as both of you stayed exactly the size the system required. Trauma bonding is frequently misunderstood as simply a strong emotional attachment formed under difficult circumstances, but it is more precise and more insidious than that. It is the neurological and psychological phenomenon that occurs when cycles of tension, rupture, and intermittent reinforcement train the nervous system to associate the source of pain with the only available source of relief. The brain, under these conditions, does not distinguish cleanly between love and survival. It processes the relationship the way it processes any high-stakes dependency, with the same neurochemical intensity, the same compulsive return, the same inability to simply decide to want something different and have that decision translate into freedom. You did not stay because you were weak. You stayed because your nervous system had been conditioned, through the specific rhythm of that relationship, to experience the absence of the person causing harm as a more acute threat than the harm itself. That is not a personal failing. That is biology responding to a relational environment that exploited its most fundamental mechanisms. And within that system, your smallness was not incidental. It was load-bearing. Every time you made yourself less to keep the peace, you reinforced the structure. Every time you swallowed a need because expressing it had previously resulted in withdrawal or punishment, you confirmed the relational contract. Every time you interpreted their emotional unavailability as something you could fix with enough patience, enough understanding, enough carefully calibrated love, you took on a weight that was never yours to carry, and in doing so, made yourself smaller under it. The relationship metabolized your self-abandonment. It required it the way a particular ecosystem requires a particular climate. Remove the condition and the entire environment becomes uninhabitable for the organisms that evolved within it. This is why your growth was not simply noticed. It was experienced as a threat. Not because you became threatening in any aggressive sense, but because your expansion disrupted the pressure differential the system depended upon. When you stopped shrinking, the container that had been built around your smallness suddenly had nothing to hold. The avoidant partner, whose entire relational strategy was organized around maintaining emotional control through distance, and whose sense of safety depended on your predictable, anxious pursuit, suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar and destabilizing territory. The dynamic they had unconsciously cultivated, in which your need for closeness justified their need for distance, in which your emotional expressiveness confirmed their self-narrative of being the more composed and self-sufficient partner. That dynamic evaporated, and what remained was not freedom for them. What remained was the raw, unmediated experience of their own attachment wound, with nothing left to project it onto, because that is what your smallness had been doing, beyond its effect on you. It had been functioning as a container for their unprocessed pain. Your visible need made their hidden need invisible, even to themselves. Your expressed longing allowed them to maintain the fiction that they did not long. Your reaching gave them something to retreat from, and the retreating gave them the sensation of agency, of choice, of being someone who did not need anyone, which is the oldest and most fiercely protected story of the avoidantly attached soul. When you grew, that story lost its supporting evidence, and a person whose entire psychological architecture has been built around a particular story about themselves, when that story is suddenly unsupported, does not simply update the story. They experience something closer to collapse. Your wholeness did not wound them, but it did, finally and irrevocably, refuse to wound itself any further on their behalf, and that refusal changed everything. Real healing is not performed for others. This truth sits at the center of everything, and it is perhaps the most radical and countercultural idea you will encounter on the journey back to yourself, because we live in a world that has thoroughly confused transformation with presentation. We have been conditioned to understand growth as something visible, something demonstrable, something that earns its legitimacy through external validation. We post the milestone. We announce the breakthrough. We measure the healing by how others respond to it, by whether the person who hurt us finally acknowledges our worth, by whether the people who once overlooked us now turn to look, by whether the transformation is sufficiently witnessed to feel real. And in doing so without meaning to, we recreate the very dynamic that wounded us in the first place. We make our internal reality dependent once again on external approval. We heal, but we heal for the audience. And healing for the audience is not healing. It is the wound in a different costume. True healing happens in the body before it happens anywhere else. This is not a spiritual abstraction. It is a precise description of how trauma is stored and how recovery actually proceeds. The experiences that shaped your attachment patterns, that taught your nervous system to associate closeness with danger or need with abandonment, did not lodge themselves primarily in your conscious mind as retrievable memories with clear narrative structures. They lodged in the body, in the autonomic nervous system, in the subcortical regions of the brain that operate beneath the reach of language and logic and conscious intention. They live in the startle response that activates before you have time to think, in the chest constriction that appears the moment someone important goes quiet, in the dissociation that descends when conflict arises in a relationship that matters to you, in the exhaustion that follows any sustained period of emotional vulnerability. The body has been keeping a record that the conscious mind was never fully given access to, and healing requires going to where the record actually lives. This means that the most significant moments of genuine recovery are frequently invisible to everyone around you. They happen in the space between stimulus and response, when for the first time there is a space. They happen in the quiet recognition that the anxiety flooding your system right now belongs to a much younger version of you, responding to a situation that no longer exists, with a threat assessment formed in a world that is no longer your world. They happen when you feel the familiar pull toward self-abandonment, toward apologizing for a need, toward minimizing a feeling, toward making yourself smaller so that someone else can remain comfortable. And instead of following the pull automatically, you pause, you notice. You choose, even briefly, even imperfectly, even while the old pattern screams at you that choosing yourself is selfish and dangerous and will result in exactly the abandonment you have always feared. That pause, that noticing, that choice. No one may ever see it, no one may ever know it happened, but in the economy of genuine healing, it is worth more than any public declaration of transformation you could make. The nervous system does not heal through insight alone. It heals through repeated experience of safety, specifically through the accumulation of moments in which the thing that was once dangerous proves itself, through actual lived experience rather than intellectual reassurance, to be survivable, to be safe, to be something other than what the original wound taught you to expect. This means healing is slow, not because you are doing it wrong, but because the nervous system is appropriately cautious. It has been burned. It does not update its threat assessments on the basis of promises or intentions or even genuine love extended by genuinely safe people. It updates through experience, through time, through the slow and patient and often frustrating process of learning at a level deeper than thought that the old rules no longer apply. And somewhere in that process, not at the end of it, not after you have arrived at some completed and certified version of wholeness, but somewhere in the middle of it, in the ordinary, unremarkable dailiness of choosing yourself again and again in ways no one will applaud, you will realize that you have stopped waiting for permission to exist fully, that the healing was never about becoming someone worthy of being chosen. It was about finally, irrevocably choosing yourself, and that choice belongs to no one else. It never did.